Today we will explore the extraordinary history of an order of knights that was born to save lives and ended up becoming one of the most feared military forces of the Crusades. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. The year is 1099. The walls of Jerusalem have just fallen. After weeks of relentless siege, the Christian armies of the First Crusade have finally breached the defenses of the Holy City. The soldiers, exhausted by the march of thousands of miles from Europe, entered the narrow streets of one of the oldest cities in the world. The hot Middle Eastern air carried the smell of blood and dust. The conquest was complete, but the true challenge had barely begun. Jerusalem at that time was a point of convergence for three of the world's greatest religions. Jews, Christians, and Muslims inhabited its neighborhoods, walked through its cramped alleys, and frequented its markets under the scorching sun of Palestine. The city possessed an unparalleled symbolic importance, and for that very reason, it attracted a constant flow of people coming from all directions. European Christian pilgrims, in particular, made long and dangerous journeys by land and sea to reach the holy places where, according to their faith, Jesus Christ had walked, preached, and been crucified. This pilgrimage was considered one of the highest acts of devotion a Christian could perform, and many were willing to risk everything for it. However, the reality that awaited these pilgrims was often cruel. Land routes crossed hostile territories, where bandits preyed upon the most vulnerable travelers. Sea crossings through the Mediterranean were equally dangerous, with storms and pirates constantly threatening the vessels. Many pilgrims arrived in the Levant, gravely ill, penniless, and without shelter. It is in this scenario of suffering that we must go back a few decades before the fall of Jerusalem to understand how one of the most remarkable institutions of medieval history emerged. Around 1048, long before the crusading armies marched toward the east, a group of merchants from the ancient maritime republic of Amalfi, in southern Italy, obtained authorization from the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt to build a religious complex in Jerusalem. These Amalfitan merchants were experienced businessmen who maintained commercial relations with the Islamic world and understood the importance of having a permanent presence in the Holy City to assist the Christian pilgrims arriving there. With this permission, they erected a church dedicated to Saint Mary Latina, a monastery, and alongside these buildings, an establishment that would change the course of history, a hospital dedicated to Saint John the Baptist. This hospital, modest in its origins, was intended to welcome Christian pilgrims who arrived in Jerusalem sick, wounded, or simply exhausted after their long journeys. The site was managed by monks of the Order of Saint Benedict, the Benedictines, who followed the tradition of charity and hospitality that characterized this ancient monastic order. The Benedictines who worked at the hospital wore dark robes, as was the custom of their order, and dedicated their days to the care of the sick. They made no distinction between patients. Christians, Muslims, and Jews were all received and treated with the same dedication. This spirit of universality in care was remarkable for the time and set the Hospital of St. John apart from many other similar institutions. The monks washed the sick, treated their wounds, offered them food and water, and provided a safe roof where they could recover before continuing their pilgrimages or starting the long journey back home. At the head of this operation was a man whose name would echo through the centuries. His name was Gerard, known later as Blessed Gerard. Information about his origins is uncertain. Traditionally, it is believed he was born around 1040 in the town of Martigues in Provence, southern France, although this information has never been confirmed with absolute certainty. What is known is that Gerard was a lay brother of the Benedictine order, a deeply devout man who had dedicated his life to the service of those most in need. He took over the direction of the Hospital of St. John, and under his leadership, the institution began to grow in importance and reputation. When the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099, the hospital had already been in operation for a few decades. The arrival of the European armies brought with it an avalanche of new challenges. The city, which was already densely populated, saw its population increase significantly, with the arrival of soldiers, settlers, merchants, and an ever-growing number of pilgrims who, encouraged by the Christian conquest, now felt safer to undertake the journey to the Holy Land. But security was, to a large extent, an illusion. Sanitary conditions in Jerusalem were precarious. The narrow streets, overcrowding, and intense heat created an environment conducive to the proliferation of diseases. Epidemics of dysentery, malaria, and typhoid fever were frequent. Added to this was the fact that battles fought near the city left behind unburied bodies, attracting rats and flies, worsening the sanitary situation in the region. Gerard's hospital became, in this context, a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. Pilgrims, settlers, and wounded soldiers flocked in search of medical care, and the demand for treatment grew every day. The hospital building was expanded, and at the peak of its operation, was capable of housing more than 1,000 patients simultaneously. The dimensions of the site were impressive by medieval standards, and the care offered there was considered advanced for the time. Gerard did not limit himself to managing the hospital in Jerusalem. He also acquired territories and properties in various parts of the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem and beyond, creating a support network that extended across Europe. In Portugal, an entire province was donated to Gerard and his brothers as early as 1114, demonstrating the reach and prestige the institution had achieved. In 1113, Pope Pascal II officially recognized the community led by Gerard as an independent religious order through the papal bull Pi Postulatio Voluntatis. This document placed the hospital and all its properties under the direct protection of the Holy See, granting it the right to freely elect its superiors without interference from local secular or religious authorities. Gerard was confirmed as the founder and first leader of the order that would become known as the Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. Gerard's death, estimated around 1120, marked the end of an era but not the end of his work. The legacy he left was that of a philanthropic leader, a man who had transformed a modest hospital into an institution of international reach, dedicated to the care of the poor, the sick, and pilgrims. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres recorded Gerard's death in his writings, and another account, the Chronicon Sancti Maxenti Picta Vensis, written before 1124, mentioned that in that same year honey rained from the sky, and that Gerard, Hospitaller of Jerusalem, died in holy conversation. His successor was a French knight named Raymond Dupuy, and it is with Raymond that the history of the order takes a completely new and unexpected turn. Raymond was a man of a different vision than Gerard. While the founder had dedicated himself exclusively to charity and the care of the sick, Raymond understood that, under the circumstances they found themselves in, charity alone would not be enough. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Crusader states were fragile territories, constantly threatened by Muslim armies seeking to reconquer the lost lands. Pilgrims traveling the roads of the Holy Land were easy targets for bandits and enemy forces. The monks working at the hospital had no military training and would be unable to defend themselves or protect their patients in the event of an attack. Raymond realized there was a critical gap in the protection of Christians in the Holy Land. Soldiers wounded in battles, fought in territories far from Jerusalem, needed to be transported over long distances to receive treatment. Many did not survive this painful journey. Sending unarmed monks to battlefields was equally impractical. A solution was needed that combined medical skills with military capability. Raymond's response was revolutionary. He decided to transform the Hospitaller order into a military order. Under his leadership, the members of the Hospital of St. John would not just be monks dedicated to the care of the sick, they would also be trained warriors, capable of wielding swords and spears, riding horses, and fighting in battle formations. The young recruits who joined the order began to study not only the art of medicine, but also the art of war. The monastery of St. John became simultaneously a hospital, a medical school, and a military academy. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that spanned several years. There is evidence that as early as 1126, a brother of the order was present as a witness to a military document, holding a title of a martial nature. Raymond formalized the change by decreeing sometime before 1136 that the Hospitallers could fight to defend the kingdom or to besiege a pagan city. This decision was a turning point in the history of the order. To differentiate the Hospitallers from the Knights Templar, another military order founded around 1119 to 1120, Pope Innocent II granted the order its own coat of arms in 1130, a silver cross on a red field. The other symbol of the Hospitallers, the famous eight-pointed cross, has origins in the Byzantine Empire, from where it migrated to the Duchy of Amalfi and was subsequently adopted by the monks of the Hospital of St. John. The 8 points represented the 8 Beatitudes proclaimed by Jesus Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. The Knights Hospitaller organized their combatant members into the categories of knights and sergeants, following a hierarchical structure similar to that of other military orders of the time. In their daily lives, the Hospitallers maintained a simple and austere appearance, faithful to the ideal of humility that characterized their monastic origins. Their robes retained the dark colors inherited from the Benedictine monks of the monastery, but now also displayed the white cross that would become the order's most recognizable symbol. The transformation of the order into a military force did not mean the abandonment of its humanitarian mission. On the contrary, the motto adopted by the Knights Hospitaller clearly expressed their two complementary vocations, to defend the faith and to serve the poor. This duality, the combination of warrior and healer, of soldier and nurse, was what made the Hospitallers unique in the panorama of medieval military orders. While the Knights Templar had been founded with an essentially military mission from the start, the Hospitallers carried at their core the original commitment to charity and the care of those in need. The territorial expansion of the order was rapid and impressive. In 1136, King Fulk of Jerusalem entrusted the Hospitallers with the administration of the castle of Beth Gibelin, a strategic fortress on the southern border of the kingdom, built to defend the territory against attacks from the Fatimid garrison in Ascalon. This was one of the first of many fortresses that would be entrusted to the order. In 1144, the Hospitallers acquired the castle of Crac de Chevalier in Syria, which would become one of the most imposing and famous fortifications of the entire Crusader period. The fortress of Margat, also in Syria, was incorporated into the order's assets in 1186. The acquisition of these castles and territories transformed the Knights Hospitaller into a significant territorial power in the Holy Land. They maintained permanent garrisons in these fortresses, patrolled the roads, escorted pilgrims, and participated actively in the military operations of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The order established command posts, called commanderies, throughout Europe, creating an administrative and financial network that ensured a constant flow of resources, materials, and recruits to sustain its operations in the East. Generally, each outpost sent 1/3 of its revenue to the order's headquarters in the Holy Land. By around 1136, the number of members in the order had already grown significantly. With the acquisition of new castles and territories, the order formalized its military character, becoming one of the most respected and feared forces of the Crusader armies. The Knights Hospitaller were not just healers who wielded swords out of necessity. They transformed into formidable warriors, trained in the most refined combat techniques of the time. Their discipline was legendary, and their courage in battle was recognized by both their Christian allies and their Muslim adversaries. It is at this point in history that we reach one of the most dramatic and revealing episodes in the trajectory of the Knights Hospitaller, the Battle of Arsuf. To understand the importance of this confrontation, it is necessary to go back a few years and examine the context that led to it. In 1187, nearly a century after the Christian conquest of Jerusalem, Sultan Saladin, ruler of Egypt and Syria, inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin. This victory paved the way for Saladin to reconquer Jerusalem, a devastating blow to Western Christendom. The news of the fall of the Holy City provoked a wave of consternation in Europe, and Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to recover the holy places. The Third Crusade, as it became known, gathered some of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Among them was Richard the Lionheart, King of England, whose reputation as a warrior was practically incomparable in his time. Richard was a king who barely set foot in his own kingdom and nearly bankrupted England to finance his crusade. Richard arrived in the Levant in June 1191 and quickly became involved in the siege of Acre. Acre fell in July 1191, and Richard began preparing his army for the march south toward Jaffa, which he intended to capture as a base of operations before attempting to retake Jerusalem. The march from Acre to Jaffa covered a distance of approximately 50 miles along the Mediterranean coast. Richard organized his marching column with meticulous military precision, demonstrating the tactical genius that would make him a legend. He positioned his cavalry between two columns of infantry to protect the knights' horses from enemy arrows during the long march. The Crusader fleet accompanied the army along the coast, providing supplies, water, and medical support for the wounded. Richard's army advanced in a tight and disciplined formation. In the vanguard marched the Knights Templar, recognized for their ferocity and unwavering discipline. In the rearguard, a position of honor and enormous responsibility, were the Knights Hospitaller, commanded by Garnier de Nablus. The choice of the Hospitallers for the rearguard was not accidental. Richard knew this was the most vulnerable position in the column, the one that would suffer the most intense enemy attacks, and he trusted the discipline and resilience of the Hospitallers to withstand that pressure. Saladin's army, estimated at about 35,000 men, followed the Crusader column from the interior, constantly harassing it with mounted archers who fired their arrows at the Christians' flanks and rearguard. The Muslim light cavalry would attack quickly and retreat, trying to provoke the Crusader knights into breaking formation and launching disorganized charges that could be easily defeated. This was the classic tactic of the Muslim armies: provoke, disperse, and then attack the isolated knights. Richard, however, refused to fall into this trap. He ordered his knights to maintain formation at all costs, no matter how intense the enemy attacks became. It was a test of excruciating patience and discipline. Day after day, for nearly 2 weeks, the Crusader army advanced under a constant rain of arrows, enduring scorching heat and thirst, while Saladin's mounted archers circled the column like wolves around a flock. Muslim chroniclers described how the Christians kept their calm under enemy fire, comparing the Crusader column to a flock of sheep surrounded by wolves that nevertheless stayed together and moved forward. The situation was particularly agonizing for the Knights Hospitaller in the rearguard. They were the primary target of the Muslim attacks, and the pressure on them increased every day. Their horses were being shot down by enemy arrows, forcing many knights to dismount and join the infantry. Their crossbowmen struggled to maintain formation, and at several points the cohesion of the rearguard was threatened. Saladin himself personally entered the fray, accompanied by 2 pages leading spare horses, trying to incite his soldiers to closer combat. His brother Safaddin also exposed himself to danger, encouraging the Muslim troops under the fire of the Crusader crossbows. Garnier de Nablus, the commander of the Hospitallers, sent repeated requests to Richard, asking for permission to counterattack. On each occasion, Richard denied the request, insisting that the right moment had not yet arrived. The English king was waiting for the perfect instant to strike his blow, the moment when a devastating counterattack would cause the maximum damage to the enemy. The decisive day was September 7th, 1191. The Crusader army had reached the river near Arsuf and was beginning to cross the open plain north of the city. It was on this terrain, a plateau 1 to 2 kilometers wide, stretching between the Mediterranean Sea and the inland hills, that Saladin decided to launch his full-scale attack. The Sultan committed his entire army to the battle, sending waves of cavalry and infantry against the Crusader column. The weight of the attack fell with special fury upon the rearguard. The right wing of the Ayyubid army, under the command of Safaddin, advanced against the Knights Hospitaller from the north, while the Syrian forces of Al-Afdal attacked them from the east. The Hospitallers found themselves surrounded on 2 sides simultaneously. Many of their infantrymen were forced to march backward to keep their shields facing the enemy, a desperate maneuver that highlighted the intensity of the pressure they faced. The Hospitaller crossbowmen fought heroically to maintain formation, but gradually they began to lose cohesion. The enemy took advantage of the gaps opening up and advanced with swords and maces, engaging the Crusaders in hand-to-hand combat. The Battle of Arsuf had reached a critical point. The Crusader rearguard was on the brink of collapse. And then it happened. The Knights Hospitaller, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, broke formation and launched a furious charge against the enemy. The traditionally accepted version of events states that this charge was launched in disobedience to Richard's orders, although this interpretation has been questioned by modern historians. Some researchers suggest that Richard may have delegated authority to trusted subordinates to identify and seize any opportune moment to order a charge, recognizing that it would be practically impossible to hear a trumpet signal amidst the din of the Ayyubid army's cymbals and gongs. Regardless of whether the charge was authorized or not, its effect was devastating. The sudden attack by the Hospitallers caught Saladin's army completely by surprise. Richard, realizing the decisive moment had arrived, reacted instantly, turning what could have been a disaster into an opportunity. He ordered a general advance, and the entire Crusader line hurled itself against the enemy. Lances were lowered, horses broke into a gallop, and steel collided with flesh. The combat was brutal and bloody. The disciplined charge of the Crusader cavalry shattered the Muslim front. Saladin's forces, though experienced and skilled, were thrown into disarray by the sudden weight of the Christian onslaught. Saladin managed to rally his troops and launch a counterattack, but Richard reacted just as quickly, regrouping his cavalry and charging again. Not once, but twice, the Crusader forces advanced in successive charges, pushing the enemy further and further back. When the dust settled, the battlefield belonged to the Crusaders. Saladin's forces had suffered heavy casualties, estimated at over 7,000 dead, while the Crusaders lost approximately 700 men. The victory at Arsuf was significant, not only in military terms, but also psychologically. It restored the morale of the Crusader armies and cemented Richard's reputation as one of the greatest military commanders of his era. Saladin himself, according to reports, reportedly recognized that Richard was a man who could never be defeated in battle. For the Knights Hospitaller, Arsuf was a moment of unprecedented glory. Their bravery and their decisive charge were celebrated by all the chroniclers of the time, and Richard the Lionheart publicly praised the courage of the Hospitallers, further elevating the prestige and symbolism of the order. The Battle of Arsuf demonstrated to the world that the Hospitallers were not just healing monks who wielded swords out of obligation. They were fierce and disciplined warriors, capable of changing the course of a battle with their determination and courage. After Arsuf, the Crusaders secured control of the central coast of Palestine, including the city of Jaffa. Although the Third Crusade ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem, a 3-year truce was negotiated with Saladin. Known as the Treaty of Jaffa, this truce ensured that Christian pilgrims from the West could once again visit Jerusalem. Saladin also recognized Crusader control over the Levantine coast as far as Jaffa. Around 1278, the Knights Hospitaller began using the color red on their battle tunics, a distinction used mainly by the leaders of the order. This change in attire reflected the growing importance and military prestige the order had achieved over nearly 2 centuries of existence in the Holy Land. However, the winds of history were blowing against the Crusader states. Throughout the 13th century, Christian positions in the Levant were gradually eroded by Muslim forces. By 1187, Jerusalem had already fallen. When Saladin reconquered the Holy City, the Hospitallers, despite being defeated, were allowed to remain for a year to close the hospital's operations and transfer their patients, a gesture that demonstrated the respect even Muslim adversaries had for the order's humanitarian mission. The final blow came in 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last significant Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. The siege of Acre was one of the bloodiest episodes of the entire Crusader era, and its fall marked the definitive end of the Christian military presence in the Levant. The Knights Hospitaller, along with the survivors of the other military orders, were forced to evacuate the Holy Land. The loss of their original base could have meant the end of the order, but the Hospitallers demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Initially, they settled in Cyprus, using Colossi Castle as their base of operations. However, desiring to have their own sovereign territory, they turned their eyes to the island of Rhodes, which at the time was part of the Byzantine Empire. After more than 4 years of military campaigning, the Hospitallers took control of Rhodes in 1310, as well as several neighboring islands and the port of Halicarnassus on the coast of Anatolia. In Rhodes, the order underwent another significant transformation. The knights, now known as the Knights of Rhodes, were forced to become a naval power to defend their island against Barbary pirates and the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire. They built a powerful fleet and patrolled the eastern Mediterranean, fighting piracy and protecting Christian sea routes. For 2 centuries, the Knights of Rhodes were the scourge of Muslim shipping in the eastern Mediterranean, constituting the last Christian bastion in the east. The order resisted two major invasions during the 15th century. The first was launched by the Sultan of Egypt in 1444, and the second by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror in 1480, the same man who had captured Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire. On both occasions, the Hospitallers managed to repel the attackers, demonstrating the effectiveness of their fortifications and the tenacity of their defenders. However, the Ottoman threat did not cease. In 1522, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent sent a massive invasion force against Rhodes. An armada of 400 ships transported an army estimated at 100,000 men to the island. Against this overwhelming force, the knights, led by Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, had only about 7,000 combatants. The siege lasted 6 months of fierce fighting. The Hospitallers fought with a bravery that impressed both Christians and Muslims. Despite their heroic resistance, Ottoman numerical superiority was simply overwhelming. At the end of the siege, the surviving Hospitallers were allowed to withdraw to Sicily with military honors. Even in defeat, Villiers de l'Isle-Adam was recognized as a man of extraordinary courage, and Pope Adrian VI proclaimed him Defender of the Faith. After 7 years of displacement and uncertainty, without a permanent base, the order found a new home in 1530. Pope Clement VII, himself a knight, negotiated an agreement with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain and Sicily. Charles V granted the Hospitallers the islands of Malta and Gozo, as well as the North African port of Tripoli, as a perpetual fief. In exchange, the knights were to send the king's representative, the Viceroy of Sicily, a single symbolic annual contribution, a Maltese falcon to be delivered on All Souls' Day. Malta was an arid and underdeveloped island, very different from prosperous Rhodes. But the knights, now known as the Knights of Malta, transformed it into a formidable fortress. They recognized that the island's location, positioned in the center of the Mediterranean between Europe and North Africa, gave it invaluable strategic value. Initially, the order settled in the town of Birgu and improved the defenses of Fort St. Angelo, which became their main fortification and seat of power. The presence of the Hospitallers in Malta soon attracted the attention of the Ottomans. In 1565, Suleiman the Magnificent sent an invasion force of 36,000 to 40,000 soldiers to expel the knights from the island and establish a new base for a possible thrust against Europe. Against this imposing force, the Hospitallers had only about 500 knights, complemented by approximately 5,600 soldiers and civilians. What followed became known as the Great Siege of Malta, one of the most heroic and bloody episodes in European military history. The siege lasted from May to September 1565, and the Hospitallers' resistance defied all odds. Grand Master Jean Parisot de la Valette, a 71-year-old veteran who had been captured by Barbary pirates in his youth and served as a galley slave for a year, led the defense with unwavering determination. When his council suggested abandoning Birgu and Senglea and retreating to Fort St. Angelo, La Valette categorically refused. The Ottomans managed to capture Fort St. Elmo after weeks of fierce fighting that cost the lives of about 6,000 Turkish soldiers, an extraordinarily high price for a single fortification. Subsequent attacks against Fort St. Michael in Senglea were equally bloody, but the defenders held out with a tenacity that baffled the Ottoman commanders. On September 1st, the Ottomans launched their last major attack, but the morale of their troops had seriously deteriorated, and the onslaught was weak and disorganized. To the encouragement of the besieged, who now saw hope of salvation, Sicilian reinforcements landed at Meliha Bay. The Ottomans, unaware that the relief force was relatively small, broke off the siege and departed on September 8th. When the Turks withdrew, the Hospitallers had only 600 men still capable of wielding weapons. The Great Siege of Malta may have been the last occasion in which a force of knights achieved a decisive victory in combat. Voltaire, the famous French philosopher, reportedly said that nothing was as well known as the Siege of Malta, so great was the impact the event had on the European consciousness. After the siege, a new city was built, Valletta, named in memory of the Grand Master who had resisted the Ottoman assault. It became the headquarters of the order in 1571 and remains the capital of Malta to this day. The Hospitallers remained in Malta for 268 years, during which they transformed the island from a poor and arid territory into a prosperous and well-fortified centre of power. They built hospitals, churches, palaces, and an impressive system of fortifications. The order also continued its naval operations against the Ottomans and Barbary pirates, maintaining a significant military presence in the Mediterranean. However, as the centuries passed, the world around the Knights changed rapidly. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century divided the order and weakened it considerably. The wealthy commanderies in Germany and the Netherlands became Protestant and split from the main Catholic branch. The order was suppressed in England, Denmark, and other parts of Northern Europe. The French Revolution in 1789 dealt another devastating blow. In 1792, the order's properties in France were confiscated by the revolutionary government, causing a very serious financial crisis, as approximately two-thirds of the knights were French, and France contributed about half of the order's total revenue. This rupture not only devastated the Hospitallers' finances, but also eliminated their main source of new recruits and removed the protection, support, and training opportunities that the French Navy had provided to the order for centuries. In 1797, Ferdinand von Hompesch was elected the last Grand Master of Malta. Unfortunately for him, the order was in an extremely difficult situation when he took office. Desperate for aid, the Knights turned to the Russian Empire and Tsar Paul I, who had developed an interest in Catholicism and the Order of St. John. On December 10, 1797, the Russian Tsar became the protector of the order. Meanwhile, in France, Napoleon Bonaparte was planning his ambitious military campaign in Egypt. Malta, strategically positioned in the center of the Mediterranean, was an essential stop on his way. The French fleet was sighted off Gozo on June 6, 1798. The approaching armada was colossal, carrying approximately 50,000 men destined for the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon requested the Grand Master to allow his ships to enter the port to replenish their water and supplies. The Grand Master replied that only 2 foreign ships could enter the port at a time. Bonaparte, knowing that such a procedure would take too long and leave his forces vulnerable to Admiral Nelson, immediately ordered a bombardment of the island. On the morning of June 11th, French troops landed in Malta and attacked several points simultaneously. Brigades commanded by future Marshals Marmont and Lannes quickly dispersed the defending forces. General Desai defeated another Maltese contingent at another point, while a third column captured the island of Gozo. The arrival of the French caused widespread panic in Valletta. Most of the approximately 300 remaining knights were elderly, and local militias were poorly trained. Some of the French members of the order had Republican sympathies and supported Napoleon. The order had the means to resist a prolonged siege, but a combination of circumstances led to capitulation. On June 12th, the order ceded sovereignty of the islands to France. Grand Master Hompesch left Malta on June 18th and resigned his post on July 6, 1799. The Knights were dispersed. The invasion ended 268 years of Hospitaller rule in Malta. A few months after the invasion, discontent with the reforms implemented by the French led to a popular revolt by the Maltese against the French garrison. The surviving Knights scattered across Europe. Tsar Paul I of Russia offered shelter to many of them in St. Petersburg, and the Knights even elected him as Grand Master, a controversial decision. The alliance with Russia, however, ended badly for both sides. The Treaty of Amiens, signed in 1802, provided for the restoration of the Knights to Malta, but the British decided to keep the island, which remained in British hands throughout the Napoleonic Wars and continued to serve as a strategic naval base until the 20th century. With the definitive loss of Malta, the order entered a period of decline and dispersion. Most of its resources came from the Russian Grand Priory, and the order was extremely weakened. In 1805, administration passed to lieutenants, as the post of Grand Master went unfilled for decades. It was only in 1879 that Pope Leo III restored the office of Grand Master, giving new life to the institution. The Order of the Knights Hospitaller also maintained a significant presence in Portugal over the centuries. Some of its members were part of the Portuguese nobility and even the royal family. The Brazilian emperors, Pedro I and Pedro II, were members of the Order of the Knights Hospitaller. a link that highlights the reach and influence the order exerted far beyond the borders of the Holy Land and the Mediterranean. In 1834, the Knights established themselves permanently in Rome, where the order remains active to this day. The Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes and of Malta, as it is officially named, adopted a new constitution in 1961 and a code in 1966, more precisely defining both its religious and sovereign status. The order is led by an elected prince and Grand Master, and its motto remains the same as it was adopted centuries ago: defense of the faith and service to the poor. Although it no longer conducts military training, the order maintains formal diplomatic relations with 114 states, including the Holy See, and has official relations with 5 other states and the European Union. Despite having no national territory, the order is considered a sovereign subject by international law. The members of the order, who today number approximately 13,500 knights and dames, remain faithful to the principles established by Blessed Gerard more than 900 years ago. Their work is entirely focused on humanitarian and health activities, maintaining good relations with the governments of various countries. The order operates hospitals, clinics, emergency care centers, and humanitarian aid programs worldwide, from Latin America to Africa, from Europe to Southeast Asia. Among the historical properties the order still maintains are a military fortress on the island of Malta, Fort St. Angelo, ceded by the Republic of Malta through a treaty, the Cavalier of St. John, also in Valletta, as well as churches and medical facilities scattered throughout Europe. On the island of Rhodes, traces of the Hospitaller presence are still visible in the impressive fortifications and the medieval hospital the Knights built during their 2 centuries of rule over the island. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta also maintains an important collaboration with other mutually recognized orders of St. John. For example, the order is one of the largest donors to the St. John Eye Hospital in Jerusalem. In this way, the original commitment to medical care in the Holy City, which began with the modest hospital founded by Amalfitan merchants in the 11th century, remains alive nearly 1,000 years later. The history of the Knights Hospitaller is the story of an extraordinary transformation. An order born in a modest hospital in Jerusalem, managed by Benedictine monks, evolved to become one of the most feared military forces of the Crusades. From the battlefields of the Holy Land to the walls of Rhodes, from the Great Siege of Malta to hospital rooms in modern Europe, the Knights Hospitaller have crossed nearly a millennium of history without ever losing sight of their original mission, to serve those most in need. The Knights Hospitaller traded fighting on the battlefields for the noble purpose of saving lives. Their 8-pointed cross, which once fluttered over the walls of Acre and the towers of Rhodes, is today displayed in hospitals, ambulances, and humanitarian aid centers in dozens of countries. The sword was replaced by the stethoscope, the armor by the white coat, but the spirit remains the same: to defend the faith and to serve the poor. The incredible story of the Knights Hospitaller has not yet come to an end. Its members continue nearly 1,000 years after the order's founding to honor the legacy of Blessed Gerard and to live according to the motto that has defined them through the centuries. In a world that often seems dominated by indifference and conflict, the persistence of this millennial order is a reminder that compassion and service to others are values that transcend time. And speaking of stories that transcend time, if you have made it this far and been captivated by this journey through the centuries, from the hospitals of Jerusalem to the fortresses of Malta, then you are part of a community that values knowledge and the great narratives of humanity. Just as the Knights Hospitaller spread their mission across the world, help spread this content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming documentary narratives. Leave your like so more people can discover these extraordinary stories, and share in the comments what impressed you most in this millennial trajectory. Every subscription, every like and every comment helps us continue bringing these great stories to you. After all, just as Blessed Gerard believed that knowledge and compassion should be shared with all, we believe that the great narratives of history deserve to be told and heard by everyone. By